Good evening. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here and to open up the PALFest Festival this year. So I wanted to share, I had basically three main impressions once I was asked to give this keynote lecture. My first was that I was kind of honored for the occasion. I think PALFest is a very important opportunity to reflect and speak with the literary community in Palestine, as well as with those outside Palestine who care and who are interested to know and engage in the literary arts. It's particularly important at this time because of the isolation and marginalization of the Palestinian cause today, as well as the gravity of what is taking place. In addition to the misunderstandings that exist outside, as well as inside some of the literary community, and the lost opportunities. My second impression was that I was surprised that I was actually asked to give this talk. Even though I do have some literary background, artistic literary background, everyone perhaps does, I guess. I'm a bit better known, or at least in my more recent years, as a writer of politics and of political economy. Political economy deals with the character and nature and structure of the relationship between politics and economics, how this shifts over time, how this relates to power dynamics and the architecture of class formation, and the formal and informal relations between economic and political actors on local, national, regional, and international levels. Literature, I'm no expert in it, you folks are, but it doesn't deal with that. It deals somehow indirectly with these issues. It's much more personal, social, psychological, emotional, intimate, communal, perhaps the downstream effects of the political, economic, structural realities that I look at. So in many senses, we're coming from different perspectives here. And that for me was a big challenge to come up with an analysis that somehow would speak to both of these sides. My third impression was that I was confused. The Literature Festival title was Palestine and the Global South. What exactly was I being asked to speak about? And what does it mean when we talk about Palestine and the Global South? Are we talking about the state level or the individual? Are we talking about even the basic concepts of Palestine? Are we talking about the UN observer state recognized by 138 different United Nations member states? Are we talking about 165 different isolated little islands across the West Bank? Do we mean the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem? Do we mean the river to the sea? Or do we even mean something broader than that? A political humanist sensibility that means that some have come to mean Palestine to them. With each of these definitions, you will get a different answer. Likewise, when we talk about the Global South, are we talking about a geographical term, a political term? Are we talking about the non-aligned movement, the Third World movement, the Global South? In fact, parts of this definitional terminological question is actually revealing in and of itself. The term Global South, from my primitive research on it, actually emerges as a less value-laden term to the Third World, which preceded it as a term. And it actually surfaces in the late 70s with the German social democrat Willy Brandt, who was asked by the World Bank to conceive of how to to offset emerging problems that they saw were coming down the road between the North and the South. The UNDP in 2003 produced a report called South-South Collaboration and the Global South. We take terminology for granted, but in Palestine and in the Global South, these things are not self-evident. And it is wrong to assume that we all have the same understandings. Having said this, and if I'm to progress, let us assume that we are going to talk about, and I will today speak in the most broadest progressive element and definition of both of these terms. Palestine, which was a national liberation movement cause that inspired millions and which thousands of Palestinians, Arabs, and other internationals have actually died for. And when we speak of the Global South, to have it mean the mutual recognition among the world's subalterns of their shared condition at the margins of the brave new neoliberal world order under globalization. But I am cautious to go down that road. I'm cautious not because I don't recognize that either of these existed or still exist today, but also because the situation is as bad as it is today. Today, we stand at the edge of an abyss, of a rapidly deteriorating global and local order, where elementary principles of liberalism have eroded and almost completely disappeared. I'm talking about the death of Khadr Adnan through starvation on his 86th day of a hunger strike after 6 different administrative detentions, a situation of repeated incarceration that is indefinite without charge or trial. I'm talking about the pogroms that we have witnessed in Hawara. I'm talking about the millions of shekels that have been designated to form militias that will be used in Palestinian cities, as well as not just in the West Bank, but also inside 48. I'm talking about Israel experimenting with suicide drones, where you can use them and blow up an entire family in the middle of the night because one person supposedly has something to do with the Palestinian resistance. I'm talking about the open declarations of racism and fascism that representatives of the Israeli government are unapologetic about. And I'm talking about the responses of the European Union and the Americans and the Western world and many others, which say nothing. And the head of the European Commission, who speaks of Israel on the 75th anniversary as a dream that was realized in the Promised Land, regurgitating Israeli talking points, a miracle that made the desert bloom. This is the miserable situation that we are confronted with today. And when we take these ideas to the idea of the Global South, and we consider the fact that Israel, for a brief moment of time, was an observer member state of the African Union, we understand that we are up Schitt's Creek. Let's look at the case of India. India, which used to lead the non-aligned movement, or attempted to. This is India that has an 800-year connection with Palestine, that has one of the largest pieces of properties in the old city, that has Palestinians of Indian origin who have citizenship of both India as well as locally, that paid money to rebuild Al-Aqsa Mosque and the damage caused in the 1927 earthquake. The same India that voted against partition, that voted against the inclusion of Israel in the United Nations, who was the first non-Arab country to recognize the state of Palestine upon its declaration in 1988, who put forward the Zionism is racism resolution in the United Nations in the 70s. This same India that today has billions of dollars of contracts with Israel and its military-industrial complex, that is working closely in the military and agricultural spheres as well as on the planning spheres, where India is modeling its occupation and land theft in Kashmir based on Israeli models, where members of the BJP, the ruling party in India, see Israel as the model of how to create a theocracy, a fascist theocracy, where Modi and Netanyahu years ago were seen and pictured walking on the beach in Tel Aviv, their trousers rolled up, speaking about how they like to do yoga together. Indeed, I am cautious. Now is not the time to romanticize or fetishize the past, but to critically examine it from all perspectives. What happened in Palestine? What happened in the global South? What happened in global dynamics that enabled the situation to get this horrific? In that light, I can only say so much. These are ultimately some of the biggest questions of the 20th century. And I'm only opening up a literature festival where you have come to listen to folks, writers and authors, not me. With that said, let's start by saying the following. Let's start by saying that indeed, and acknowledging indeed, that imperialism and colonialism were pushed back by the successes of the decolonization movements. After World War II, imperialism and colonialism was bankrupted and in some cases defeated by the nationalist movements. And this created the space for formerly colonized countries for the first time in hundreds of years to experience self-determination. Imperialism, colonialism was forced to deal with the third world and the new nations that emerged because they fought back and destroyed the basis for their oppression, in addition to the fact that the Europeans and the West slaughtered themselves, 60 million dying in World War II. They were not in a position to hold on to global empires after such a slaughter. That is when we begin to see the new efforts to form something new amongst this new population, this new constituency of countries who became free. This is the Bandung moment, the non-aligned movement moment. It's instructive to read the final paper of the Bandung conference because it gives you a sense of what's really going on at the moment. The final statement reads some of the following points I'm going to make. It promoted economic development between Asian and African regions, to provide technical assistance to one another, to get more money from the World Bank, believe it or not. It talked about the vital need to stabilize commodity trade because the Europeans were dividing and ruling and using these places as cheap raw material suppliers. They were asking for the development of nuclear energy. They were asking to coordinate and consult amongst one another before they went to international forums so that they could organize a collective position. And they were also calling for the fundamental principles of human rights set forth in the Charter of the United Nations to be respected, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. These countries had been figuratively, and in many cases literally, raped for hundreds of years. Here we get to the question of Palestine at Bandung. The statement on Bandung, on Palestine at Bandung, reads the following. It says, the Asian African Conference declares its support of the rights of the Arab people of Palestine and calls for the implementation of the United Nations resolutions on Palestine and the achievement of the peaceful settlement of the Palestine question. They were calling for implementation of United Nations resolutions at the time, of which two were the most significant. 181, which is the partition plan, and 194, which is the return of the refugees of course. In that light, it's important to note, and I will remind you, that there were no Palestinians really represented there, even though there were leftovers of the delegitimized leadership that attended. Israel was invited to the Bandung conference, but that invitation was withdrawn because the Arabs said, we will not attend, and the whole conference was subject to collapse. I will also remind you that the PLO was not yet formed, but the Palestinian position on 181 and 181 in particular was to reject it. They were against, we were against, and the Arabs were against partition. And Bandung was calling for its implementation. Parts of me want to stop because of this. I find it, you think it's suitable? I don't know. What do you think? Keep talking? Yalla, let's stay focused. Okay. Bismillah. Okay. Let's look to the head of one of the heads of the non-aligned movement, Nehru himself, who at Bandung, how he responded to the position of the Arabs on Palestine at Bandung. It's quite instructive. He said, we must consider what the conference can actually do about the problem of Palestine. The question of negotiations should not be ruled out. This is after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He also asked how the matter could be settled as long as the Arabs refused to negotiate. How are we going to solve this thing? He also, while he agreed that the Zionists were aggressive, he added that we must remember that the tragic suffering of the Jews in the Second World War and the massacre of the Jews by fascists and Nazis. And he also noted that any resolution coming out of the conference would lack moral force since Israel's side has not been present. I've recently been studying the Indian case study and its relation with Palestine and India. Israel, India, Palestine, that triangle. The Zionists attempted in the pre-state days to make connections with Congress, but Congress actually took a very important and strong line, and they were not successful in those attempts. But Zionists were successful in making some connections both with the left in India as well as with the right in India in the pre-state period. The Praja Socialist Party, for example, one of the early Indian socialist parties, supported political relations with Israel and was a co-member of the Second International together with the Zionist Mapai Party. On the right wing, Bharatiya Jansangh Party, the predecessor to the BJP, which was also calling for establishment of full diplomatic relations with Israel. The Congress Party, as I said, rejected, and that was an important historical stand that they took, not least because the Indians had the same colonial oppressors as the Palestinians, and that the entire justification for the creation of the State of Israel was that it would be the protector of the road to India, the jewel of the crown. After the state, however, India officially did recognize Israel in 1950 and opened up consular offices in 1953. Nehru justified this as an act that merely recognized an established fact and noted that 2 Muslim countries had already recognized Israel, Turkey and Iran. India also apparently sold Israel uranium in 1955. Israel also sold India in 1962 and in 1965 weapons in its wars against China and then later in Pakistan. Now bear in mind at the time that the Palestinian colonial question with Zionism was being born at the moment when the rest of the world was decolonizing. It was a new case of colonialism, somewhat, when everybody else was shedding the colonial manacle. 1956 was the key year because this was the year of the tripartite aggression where Egypt is attacked by India. Excuse me. This whole thing is a bit surreal. All right. Egypt was being attacked by Israel, France, and Egypt in a bold-faced attempt to roll back history and reimpose colonial rule and control over the Suez Canal. It was only the Americans who stood up and said, no, we will not do that, because they understood that those tides of history could not be rolled back, but at the same time positioned themselves well to be the new arbiters of colonialism and imperialism in the region, which we later see when 1967 takes place. Israel's role in this was exposed, of course, as a new colonial watchdog in the region. All of this, however, speaks to a much more complicated history of one around the question of the non-aligned movement. And in fact, if we try to hold a candle to history and melt the wax of lip service, a different reality begins to appear. Yes, there was solidarity, both on the state level as well as on the popular level. But there was also realpolitik. The situation in Palestine was considered egregious and outrageous because it was and is outrageous and egregious. In 30 years, Great Britain increased the settler population from 10% to a third of the population, got it to a situation, gave it the institutions, including armies, representative government, judiciaries, police forces, that put it in the position to conduct an ethnic cleansing campaign within 30 years. Think about what that would have meant if every country in the global south. Of course they feared it. It was a horrific precedent. And for that reason, they stood up and said no, because the global south understood exactly the horrors of what colonialism could do. The first genocides were tested first on these populations. There were also, of course, other factors that led to Palestinian solidarity with Palestine. The Middle East was always and remains super important for countries of the global south and the global north when it comes to being in between East and West, for trade, labor, and capital investment. Asia's high reliance on Arab oil tempered inter-Israeli-Asian relations over the years because the Arab-Indian trade relations saw India exporting cotton, textile, tea, and jute in exchange for mineral oils, phosphate, raw cotton, and some food. Basically, Arab states were leveraging their relationships in exchange for political loyalty at the UN, given that they had alternative suppliers for these goods, while India didn't have it when it came to cheap oil. The Arabs could have bought their tea and their rice from other places, but they chose to go to India to make that deal. Don't forget that 76% of Indian imports and over 70% of its exports also went through the Suez Canal. There also was the Arab market, which dwarfed the Israelis. Why make relations with Israel when you have hundreds of millions of Arabs you can sell your products to? Furthermore, if you didn't want to go to the World Bank and you needed finance for your developmental projects, you could always go to the Arabs. And in fact, that's exactly what many of them did. To say nothing of labor and remittances, which today has a population of 10 million South Asians working in the Gulf states. These factors played important structural roles in the background that enabled Palestine to occupy the role that it did as a source of solidarity, and to make the Palestine movement one of the richest national liberation movements in the world history. There were other reasons too that were even darker. Support for Palestine served as a cover or a proxy for things like the Great Defeat in 1967 and the withdrawal of the Arab states from the front lines of the struggle with Israel and Zionism. Arab governments promoted the Fedayeen and the PLO because they understood they could control them from afar, but also they had vested interest in the romanticization of this model because it obscured their own weaknesses. Asian states had their own dark reasons around this. In the case of India, India needed to maintain the confidence of the Arab bloc of votes at the UN, which was important insofar as it wished not to alienate neither domestic Muslims, which were 10% of the Indian population, nor to allow for the creation of a pan-Arab, pan-Muslim bloc on the question of Kashmir. One does not have the time, temerity, or hubris to pretend that one could understand the entirety of what happened to the Third World. Its experiments in building an alternative to the first or second worlds, or its fight amongst itself, within the Third World itself. And how all of this created the conditions for neoliberalism. But neoliberalism is an important last point here, because after this last decline, this history I have spoken to you of, neoliberalism offered elites in the South, many of whom came from the national liberation movements, a solution to their very particular political and economic problems. How to prop up a declining legitimacy, lack of democracy through economic growth, satisfying propertied classes, to get the diplomatic, financial, technical, and military support of the United States, while not giving an opening to opponents on the left, whether these were political parties or their labor movements in the South. Neoliberalism as a development strategy met these aims because it reorients the economy into export industries, reoriented them into international trade, which opened up for the doors for international capital and petrodollars to come in, and foreign ownership. Petrodollars, the World Bank, and the United States in a unipolar world. From here, it is not difficult to see how we got to where we are today and the sclerosis that exists in the global South as a concept, as well as within the Palestine movement. After the Egyptian Infitah, the Camp David Accords, how petrodollars funneled into Fatah allowed it to control the PLO and buy out a loyal opposition on the left. Fatah provided maximalist discourse, but in practice was reactionary with petty bourgeois characteristics. It was against revolution from below and expressed non-intervention in Arab state affairs, including when they were dictatorships and including on class questions. I've gone on for too long, but these issues are big. All this said, it's important not to engage in nostalgia, fetishization, and romance, nor is it's equally important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to try and extract the exact lessons of this experience, to be patient, to recognize that politics is not neat, it's messy, and you have to get your hands dirty. It requires patience and listening, but also action. It is in the streets and not in the cafes. It requires sound institutional processes. It requires radical democracy and a strong left. It requires understanding for the suffering of the people, their traumas and fears, why they cling to ideas, people, personas, parties, and to appreciate what colonialism did to them and also what we did to ourselves. At our best, the Palestine movement and the Global South had these. The debates were from the center to the left, not from the center to the right, in a context of the center itself shifting rightward, increasingly rightward. Here, perhaps, is where the different strands of where I began may begin to come together. Because as writers, academics, intellectuals, and artists, we are tasked with wading through this mess, being honest and creative, to try to find solutions, to avoid kitsch, to name things in their proper stead. In this sense, there may be great similarity between the traditions of literature and political economy, where they meet together around principles of sensitivity, awareness, with heart, combined with discipline and institution. I wish you good luck. I wish us all good luck. Thank you.